And here is Mr. Bernstein.
My dear young friends, on our last program, we devoted so much time to introducing our new Philharmonic Hall to you and to introducing you to the new science of acoustics that we didn't get to talk very much about music. So today, we're going to make up for lost time and talk about the meat and potatoes of music, the main course, which is melody. Now, to some people, music and melody are the same thing. It's the whole meal, so to speak. When you think of music, you think of melody right away. And they're right in a way, because what is music anyway, except sounds that change and move along in time? And that's practically a definition of melody, too. A series of notes that move along in time, one after another. Well, if that's true, then it's almost impossible to write music that doesn't have melody in it. I mean, if a melody is simply one note coming after another, how can a composer avoid writing melodies if he just writes notes? He must write melodies all the time. For example, he writes one note, then he writes another. Well, that's already a sort of melody. It's a two-note melody, sort of. Then we add another note. Well, it's already a little more melodious, isn't it? But if he then adds a few more, oh, we've got Mendelssohn's Wedding March. See how simple it is? Where there's music, there's melody. Can't have one without the other. Well, then why do so many people complain about music that has no melody? Some people say they don't like Bach fugues because they don't find them melodic. And others say the same thing about Wagner operas, and others about modern music, and others about jazz. What do you suppose they mean when they say it's not melodic? What are they talking about? Isn't any string of notes a melody? Well, I think the answer is in the fact that melody can be a lot of different things. It can be a tune, or it can be a theme, or a motive, or a long melodic line, or a bass line, or an inner voice, all those things. And the minute we understand the difference among all those kinds of melody, then I think we'll be able to understand the whole problem. You see, people usually think of melody as a tune, something you can go out whistling, that's easy to remember, that sticks in your mind. What's more, a tune almost never goes out of the range of the normal human singing voice, that is, too high or too low. Nor should a tune have phrases that last longer than the normal breath can sing them. After all, melody is the singing side of music, just as rhythm is the dancing side. But the most important thing about a tune is usually that it's complete in itself. It seems to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it leaves you feeling satisfied. In other words, it's a song, like Gershwin's Summertime, or Schubert's Serenade, or your favorite Elvis Presley number. But in symphonic music, which is what we're mostly concerned with here, tunes aren't exactly in order, because since they're complete in themselves, tunes don't cry out for further development. And as I hope you remember from former programs of ours, development is the main thing in symphonic music, the growing of a melodic seed into a big symphonic tree. So that seed mustn't be a complete tune, but rather a melody that leaves something still to be said, to be developed. And that kind of melody is called a theme. Well, that's already a problem for those people who are always expecting music to consist of full-blown tunes. So they naturally find these incomplete themes less melodic, let's say. I suppose then they should complain about the famous four-note theme that opens Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. That's hardly melodic at all. Or about this theme from his Seventh Symphony, which is mostly harping on the same note. But both of those themes are kind of melodies, even though they're not tunes. That's the important thing to remember. They're not tunes, but they're themes. Now, of course, there are symphonic themes that are much more melodious than those. Only think of Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, for example. Now that theme is practically a whole tune in itself. What is it about that big, tuneful theme that makes it so attractive and beloved all over the world, besides the fact that Tchaikovsky was a melodic genius? Well, the answer is repetition, either exact repetition or a slightly altered repetition within the theme itself. And it's that repetition that makes the melody stick in your mind. And it's the melodies that stick in your mind that are likely to please you the most. Popular songwriters know this, and that's why they repeat their phrases so often. Just think of that big song hit, Mac the Knife. Ba, 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 repeating over and over. Well, the same technique works just as well in symphonic music. For instance, let's just see how Tchaikovsky went about building up that lovely theme we just heard by simply repeating his ideas in a certain arranged order, what I like to call the 1-2-3 method. In fact, so many famous themes are formed by exactly this method that I think you ought to know about it. Here's how it works. First of all, there's a short idea or a phrase. That's number one. Now, second, the same phrase is repeated, but with a small variation. That's the second part, almost the same as the first. And the third, the tune takes off in a flight of inspiration. And so on. That's the 1-2-3 method. It's like a three-stage rocket, or like the countdown in a race. On your mark, get set, go. Or in target practice, ready, aim, fire. Or in a movie studio, lights, camera, action. It's always the same, 1, 2, and then 3. And there are so many examples of this melodic technique, I almost don't know where to begin. But let's take, for one example, our good old standby, Beethoven's Fifth. Here, 1, on your mark. 2, get set. 3, go. One, 2, 3. Or do you know that haunting theme in the César Franck Symphony? It's the same thing. First, there's a phrase. Then he repeats the phrase with a slight change, a rising intensity. And then comes the relaxed conclusion. Or the same thing is true in Mozart's Hafner Symphony. It goes, ready, aim, fire, and so on. There are millions of them, examples of this 1-2-3 design. And don't forget that the heart of the matter is repetition. 2 is always a repeat of 1, and 3 is the takeoff. Well, now that we know a couple of the secrets that make music sound melodic, let's start looking for some of the reasons why people find certain kinds of music unmelodic. We've already discovered that what appeals most to people as melody is a fully spun out tune, right? And that when they get instead an incomplete tune or a theme, they begin to have trouble. So you can imagine that when they hear music made out of melodies that are even shorter than themes, they have even more trouble. For example, that famous opening of Beethoven's Fifth again. Ba 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 ba. That's so short, it's not really even a theme, but what is called a motive. Now, a motive can be as little as 2 notes, or 3 or 4, a bare melodic seed, the raw material out of which much longer melodic lines are made. Now, you remember I said that certain people find Wagner's operas unmelodic? Well, this is why, because Wagner usually constructed those huge operas of his out of tiny little motives, instead of writing regular tunes, such as the Italian opera composers used. But how wrong they are to say Wagner doesn't write melody. He writes nothing but melody. only it's melody that's made out of motives. Now, let me show you how. You've all heard of Wagner's great opera Tristan and Isolde, and I'm sure you've heard the prelude. Now, this prelude begins with a four-note motive, like this. And immediately after comes another motive, also of four notes. Now, the exciting thing is the way Wagner puts these two motives together. He makes the second motive begin smack on the end of the first one, so that the last note of one and the first note of the other are joined, locked together, locking the two motives securely, like this. Now he adds some marvelous harmony underneath, and this is what you get, the beginning of Tristan and Isolde. Now that's already much more than a motive, or even of two motives. It's become what's called a phrase, just as a series of words in language becomes a phrase. And Wagner, by using this method of joining motives together and making phrases out of them, and then sentences out of the phrases, and then paragraphs out of the sentences, finally turns out a whole story, a prelude to Tristan that is a miracle of continuous melody without end, seemingly, even though there isn't a tune anywhere in it. Do you begin to see what I mean by understanding melody in a different way? If you think you don't, just listen to a couple of minutes of this famous prelude now, and I'm sure you'll be surprised to find that you do understand it very well.